Last year, if you paid any attention to the media hype surrounding the release of Crazy Rich Asians, you may have noticed the name of another film being mentioned quite frequently.
It's the Joy Luck Club.
Joy Luck Club.
Movies Joy Luck Club.
Joy Luck Club.
And if not already familiar with that name, you may have gone online to find out more about the Joy Luck Club, only to find... Alright, so I think I can say without fear of contradiction that the Joy Luck Club is a controversial movie. It's very much a love it or hate it affair, and similar to other Hollywood Asian stories such as The World of Suzie Wong, the idea of the film has come to overshadow the actual content itself. You can find scads of chat room discussions or online comments bemoaning the reputation of the film, but if you want to find more information, find out what the film is actually about, you're going to have a little more difficulty. And quite frankly, I find that to be a shame, because the film, by itself, is quite remarkable and worthy of discussion. Therefore, in this video, I would like to contribute to that exact discussion, while also addressing the main criticisms levied at the film, which have contributed to its maligned reputation. Now, before I begin, I should make it clear that I am focusing on the 1993 film adaptation of The Joy Luck Club, as opposed to the original 1989 novel by Amy Tan, for several reasons. Firstly, Tan was heavily involved in the making of this film, co-writing the script with Ronald Bass, and in their own words, the film comprises the emotional core of the story which Tan set out to tell. What you get in the film is what Tan wanted to convey in the novel. Many details of the story were removed or streamlined for the purposes of transitioning it to the film medium, but the messages remain the same, and those changes themselves are important to understanding the criticisms levied at the Joy Luck Club. I will be discussing the changes that occurred in the adaptation, but for your listening convenience, unless otherwise stated, all plot points which I detail come from the film. To provide structure for this analysis, I believe the best way to examine the Joy Luck Club is through the lens of its four pairs of mothers and daughters. The essential plot of the Joy Luck Club revolves around four mothers, whose personal experiences have shaped their styles of parenting, and four daughters, whose misinterpretation or ignorance of these experiences have shaped their own lives and contributed to the conflict of their own stories. Essentially, it is a story about parents realizing their mistakes and trying to correct them before their children make their own mistakes as a result. So, let's begin. If there is a main character in the ensemble cast of The Joy Luck Club, that character would be June Jingmei Woo. The story begins and ends with her, and while the other daughters have one central conflict in their subplots, June has two. The first of these conflicts revolves around her mother's expectations for her. When June is 9, her mother, Sooyeon, makes her take up piano practice, in the hopes that she will turn out to be a musical prodigy. As is often the case in these situations, June is less than enthusiastic.
Yes, little Johnny, you shall play the violin, because I never had the chance when I was a child. Well, you got the chance now, why don't you learn it now?
It also doesn't help matters that, from June's perspective, Sooyeon's main motivation in doing all this is to upstage their neighbor LINDO Jong and her daughter Waverly, who is a local chess champion and a source of constant bragging on LINDO's part. To June, actually wanting to play the piano is secondary to providing her mother with her own source of bragging rights. As such, she does not approach practice very seriously, and after a disastrous concert, June refuses to ever play again. As June grows up, she keeps failing to meet what she thinks to be her mother's great expectations of her. She drops out of college, she only manages to get a job as a copywriter, and she remains unmarried by the end of the film. And for most of that time, most of her life, June has felt like a failure, a child who has failed to live up to the expectations of a pressurizing tiger mom. But here's the thing. Soo-yeon isn't a tiger mom. Her desire for June to be someone great is not motivated by braggadocio or pompousness. Rather, it comes from a much more visceral and painful place in her past. Many years ago, during the Second Sino-Japanese War, Soo-yeon had a husband and 2 baby girls. However, when she was forced to flee her home in Guilin because of the war, by the time she made it to Chungking, where her husband was stationed, she had abandoned her babies, left them by the side of the road. June knows about these babies. She hears about them when she is a young girl, but she does not hear all of the story. All her mother tells her is that by the time she had reached Chungking, she had lost everything. June cannot comprehend why her mother would abandon her own children, what connection that even has to her mother's hope for her. To June, her mother's supposed murder of her babies was simply a horrid act of cruelty, which she can never forgive. Even by the time of her mother's death, June refuses to forgive. However, she does come to understand, at least partially. One night, when the Jongs and Woos have dinner together, June feels upstaged once again by Waverly's successful career as a businesswoman. And when June looks to Soo-yeon for defense, she replies,
True. Cannot teach style. June not like Waverly. Must be born this way.
June, of course, feels humiliated and betrayed. And later that night, all the resentment towards not living up to her mother's expectations come out, and they have a fight. And in that argument, Soo-yeon finally reveals,
Of me. Not expect anything. Never expect. Only hope. Only hoping best for you. It's not wrong to hope.
When Soo-yeon says that one cannot teach style, she means that June is the one with style. June may not have success, but she has kindness and heart. And more than that, she has stability. A copywriter may not be a prestigious job, but it pays the bills and puts food on the table. Even if she is not a 1980s businesswoman like Waverly, she has everything she needs to live a happy and satisfying life. And what more could a mother ask for her daughter?
I see you.
Sometime later, Soo-yeon would pass away. However, the story would not end there. Similar to June, Waverly has resentment towards her mother Lindo that goes as far back as childhood. However, the details are slightly different. When Waverly is a child, she discovers a love of chess and is soon hailed as a prodigy. Lindo is, of course, elated by all this, and she wastes no time in letting the whole town know what a genius her daughter is. However, Waverly feels smothered by her mother's boasting and eventually gives up chess altogether. To make matters worse, Waverly always second-guesses herself due to her mother's constant criticisms on her and her life. This all culminates in a dinner where she introduces her family to her new fiancé, Rich. Rich is kind of a himbo, and honestly, that's one of the main reasons Waverly adores him. In the words of her own actress,
Waverly is the bitch of the film.
So, for such a strong, dominant woman to have essentially a giant puppy for a boyfriend, well, her attraction to him is pretty obvious. Also, while it's never explicitly stated like it is in the book, you can see from their interactions that Rich is a good father to Shoshana, who is Waverly's daughter from a previous marriage. So, Rich really seems like the perfect fit for someone like Waverly. However, while Rich is a good fit for Waverly, she worries that he might not live up to her mother's expectations. And indeed, when Waverly tries to break the news of Rich to Lindo, Lindo has several critical comments prepared for him. And at the dinner, Rich's himbo mannerisms, while cute and endearing in other situations, really only serve to make the dinner an awkward disaster in Waverly's eyes. What Waverly doesn't know, or at least what she doesn't fully understand, is where LINDO comes from when she criticizes. When LINDO was only 4 years old, her mother arranged for her to be married to a rich family's son. From that day onward, LINDO was treated as though she was no longer a part of her mother's family, because technically she wasn't. LINDO loved her mother intensely, but this love could not be reciprocated in full because to do so would have been too painful for her mother to bear when the day finally came to give her away. To LINDO, criticism and commentary are how she expresses love. By criticizing, she is demonstrating that the object of her criticism is worthy of her time and attention, and of improving itself. What Waverly interpreted as smothering boastfulness when she was a child was LINDO's attempt to avoid the mistake her own mother made when raising her. And when Waverly rejected her mother's showmanship, LINDO saw it as Waverly being ashamed of her mother. This hurt LINDO. Even though she is a parent, LINDO is still a person, and, as people, how we were loved as children influences how we express and interpret love as adults. LINDO's mother gave her away. Even though she loved LINDO, she only ever showed that love in occasional moments, because she knew that someday she would have to say goodbye forever, and she could not bear to give too much love to someone she would never see again. To LINDO, meanwhile, those tiny moments of love are the most precious memories she has, and in contrast to her own mother, LINDO chooses to smother her own daughter with emotion, to ensure she does not go through what she went through herself. It is very telling that, when she decides to punish Waverly, the worst punishment LINDO can come up with is to ignore her.
Did you hear what I said?
And indeed, when she and Waverly have a climactic confrontation over Rich, LINDO explicitly says,
If I don't like him rich, I act polite, say nothing. Let him have big cancer. Let my daughter be a widow.
Waverly and LINDO's story illustrates how, in our hurry to not repeat our parents' mistakes, we often make mistakes of our own. LINDO and Waverly have a chance to reconcile, to bring the miscommunications and misunderstandings out in the open and fix them before it is too late. But other characters skirt a little more closely to the edge before finally understanding their mistakes. As mentioned previously, several story details of the Joy Luck Club were streamlined to fit into a 2.5-hour movie. One of the most obvious examples of this is the story of Lina and her mother, Ying. While the basic plot beats and structure are the same, several details are omitted for the sake of time. And while this streamlined plot does result in some messaging fumbles, which we will address, it also introduces a new, equally important message. Ying St. Clair is, in her own words, a ghost. She came from a rich upbringing, but ended up marrying an abusive husband. The scars of this relationship, both physical and mental, are still present and visible by the time Lina's story begins. And indeed, caring for her mother as she suffers a PTSD panic attack is Lina's establishing character moment in the film. This brings us to Harold, Lina's husband. Harold has a system where everything he and Lina buy is split 50-50. This is ostensibly to show that they are equals in the relationship, but, as Lina points out, since he makes 7 times her salary and tends to consume more than her, it doesn't necessarily work out so neatly. Lina is dissatisfied with her relationship, but does not want to speak up about it because in her mind, the only alternative to someone like Harold is someone like her mother's old husband. One of the main criticisms levied at the Joy Luck Club is that it demeans Asian masculinity. And it's pretty easy to see the validity of this criticism, when the most overtly masculine Asian character is this guy, and the main Asian husband we see is this guy.
Honey, isn't there a generic brand of cat food?
However, I would argue that this is a necessary and even vital aspect for Lina's personal character arc to make sense. Lina sees the scars from the abuse that her mother suffered. She sees what a toxic, violent man can do to someone, and it terrifies her. In order for Lina's story to work, it is necessary for her to associate passion with pain. However, along with openly criticizing the concept of toxic masculinity, the film also subtly criticizes the conflating of toxic masculinity with masculinity in general. More than anything else, Lina desires safety and security, and Lina chooses Harold because he is safe, because she equates safety with happiness. However, Harold is clearly not the right fit for Lina. The thing is, Harold isn't even a bad guy. He's just not the person that Lina needs. It's true, he can seem somewhat ignorant or uncaring, but he is upfront with his expectations and desires for their relationship from day one. And when Lina expresses doubt about the arrangement, he very calmly tells her,
Well, I know what our marriage is based upon. And if you don't, then you better think about it before you start to change things.
If Harold is not what Lina needs, then she needs to find someone else. Which may sound harsh, but just a few seconds later, that's exactly what Ying tells Lina.
Do you know what you want? I mean, from him.
Respect. Tenderness.
Then tell him now. And leave this lopsided house. Do not come back until we give you those things.
And, sure enough, in true Hollywood happy ending fashion, the next scene shows Lina happily together with a new man. While we only see him for a brief moment, from the conversation and his manner, we can tell that he has many traditionally masculine qualities, such as athleticism, assertiveness, and confidence. However, this is also tempered by qualities such as respectfulness, romance, and kindness. In short, he represents an ideal of Asian masculinity that is non-toxic, and very attractive, if I may be so bold as to say. Now, in the book, this message is not present. However, another, equally important message is. As you may have guessed from the name St. Clair, Lina's father, in the book at least, is not Asian, but rather Anglo-Irish. Ying-Ying's first husband is also a philanderous cad, but his abuse is limited to his philandering, unlike in the film, where he is far more violent towards Ying-Ying. Mr. St. Clair, meanwhile, is also not violently abusive. However, he is clearly negligent towards his wife and daughter, often putting words into Ying-Ying's mouth or speaking over her, due to her poor grasp of English. This aspect of the book illustrates an important theme that is sadly lost in translation with the film. Amy Tan is smart enough to realize that because issues like sexism or racism are systematic, the question is not really which society is more or less sexist or racist or what have you, but rather what systems do these societies put in place to sustain and justify sexism or racism or what have you. Both of Ying-Ying's husbands could be said to be cruel, but the question of who is more or less cruel really isn't the issue. The issue is simply how each of them is cruel in a different way. This environment contributes to Lina's character arc in the book, being more about her sense of self-worth, as opposed to the idea of passion versus pain. Book Lina latches onto Harold not because he is safe, but rather because he is the first person to show her any real affection. Like in the movie, though, he clearly isn't the right person for Lina. And once Lina realizes that not being unhappy isn't the same thing as being happy, she comes to a similar realization that their relationship has to either change or end. So, as you can see, while the film streamlines Lina and Ying-Ying's arcs, they don't necessarily change all that much. What changes there are in the film are more changes of omission, as opposed to structural changes to the narrative. However, one subplot in the film that is significantly different from its book counterpart is... Unlike Lina's story, where the basic plot beats remain the same even as the underlying message slightly changes, the story of Rose Shu has the opposite happen. Rose's arc in the book and her arc in the film are almost completely different, but they have the same underlying message and moral. The reason for this is probably because the story of An-mei Shu, Rose's mother, is the most faithfully adapted part of the film. This makes sense, as it is the most autobiographical part of Amy Tan's book, with An-mei's mother being heavily based off Tan's own grandmother. And the message of Rose's story is probably one that is very near and dear to Tan, herself married to a white man, as it discusses that lightning rod topic of white men, Asian women couples. So, in the film, Rose meets her future husband Ted in college. Ted is a rich kid who is used to people telling him what he wants to hear, and he is immediately drawn to Rose's frank and blunt nature. When Ted takes Rose to meet his parents and his mother tries to dissuade the Asiatic from seducing her innocent white boy, Ted stands up to his mother and wins Rose's affection in the process. Things seem fine at first, but after getting married and actually having to be a wife to a high society wasp, Rose's status as a racial other starts to weigh heavily on her, and she slowly crafts herself into a submissive, geisha-like housewife to show that she is worthy of being by Ted's side. She even has a child with him, solely because it is something expected for a housewife such as herself. Ted is very clearly unhappy and makes this apparent, but Rose only digs herself deeper, until finally the marriage breaks, and Ted asks for a divorce. Things look pretty bleak, but thankfully, An-mei is there to give some sage advice, and tell her own story. When An-mei was young, her own mother was forced to become a concubine to a rich man, and as the child of her mother's previous marriage, An-mei was in an especially lowly position. It was only after An-mei's mother committed suicide on an auspicious date that An-mei was allowed the opportunity to demand a better lot in life, being able to wield the vengeance of her mother's ghost as a viable bargaining tool. That was the day An-mei learned to shout, as she puts it. And, sure enough, by reasserting herself, by shouting, just as she did at the start of their relationship, Rose is able to become the woman she once was, and she and Ted are able to resolve their marital strife. In contrast to his film counterpart, Ted in the book is a complete louse. He's a louse, okay? He's a complete louse. In the film, he's Andrew McCarthy, but in the book, he's James Spader, all right? He is spoiled, he is entitled, and he becomes dissatisfied with Rose not because she loses that special something, but because he grows bored with her. Even when he confronts his mother, like in the film, the source of his anger isn't her racism, but the fact that she tells him that he cannot do something he wants to do. Book Ted has already decided that he is entitled to Rose, and no one can dissuade him otherwise. Rose in the book, meanwhile, has done her best to fully assimilate into American culture.
And you've never been with an Asian guy, right?
No,
Why? Because they have small dicks.
Because like dating my own brother. I didn't
You need to.
And while Ted's dominating personality is a clear warning sign of his lousiness, it is also deeply attractive to Rose. Book Rose is terrified of responsibility, because when she was a child and she was put in charge of all her siblings, her youngest brother being drowned. This is why, despite Ted clearly being bad news, she likes how he makes all-important decisions for her. It is really only after he grows sick of this attitude of hers that she finally starts to see his true colors. And after much soul-searching and counseling from friends and family, Rose learns to shout, to make decisions for herself, and to tell Ted where he can stick it.
Now get out of my house!
In Rose and Ted, the book and the film of the Joy Luck Club both present an Aesop on the subject of white men, Asian women couples. That Aesop being that the women in these relationships should not feel pressured to conform to stereotypes or racist expectations. A relationship is a partnership, after all. Both sides have to be on board for the thing to work. The main difference between the book and the film in this regard is in how they choose to tell this Aesop. The film chooses to show what makes a healthy relationship healthy, while the book chooses to show what makes a toxic relationship toxic. And this change makes sense. After all, Hollywood does love its happy endings, so injecting some positivity into Rose's story helps take away some of the book's bleakness. However, as we will soon see, this change, as well as other changes to the overall story, had some unintended and tragic consequences. But before we get to all that, there is one more story that needs to be told. Alright, so, about those babies. As mentioned earlier, where the other characters of the Joy Luck Club have one major conflict in their subplots, June has two. The first has to do with her mother's hopes for her, and the other has to do with the stories her mother tells her before her death. The film begins with this story being told.
The old woman remembered a swan she had bought many years ago in Shanghai for a foolish sum. This bird, boasted the market vendor, was once a duck that stretched its neck in hopes of becoming a goose. And now look, it is too beautiful to eat.
And the fabled swan continues to pop up throughout the film. It seems like some basic Chinese fable with a little hint of Americana thrown in, but there's just one problem. As other people who are far smarter than I am have pointed out, there is no prior basis for this swan in Chinese myth or fable. Tan seems to have made it up, almost completely whole cloth. So what gives? Why go to the trouble of presenting a made-up fable like it's the real thing, instead of drawing from an actual pre-existing mythical stable? Critics of Amy Tan have said that it's because she's a shameless traitor whore to her fellow Asian Americans, but I have a slightly different take on the subject. To me, the narrative purpose of the swan story is best summed up by this particular scene.
For a long time now, the woman wanted to give her daughter the single swan feather and tell her,
Is the swan real? Is there really a swan?
I don't know, baby. It's my mama's story.
And we can't ask her 'cause she's dead.
Let's ask ourselves, why do we tell fables, myths, and other stories? To preserve culture, to pass down tradition? Those are all good answers, but why do those? The answer is to validate our existence, and to be proud of who we are. Think about it. We say pithy phrases like representation matters, but why does it matter? Why is it so important to see people like us in stories? It's because by seeing a story so similar to our own, we can see that we are not alone, that we matter. But here's another thing. How many of us remember all the stories our parents told us in perfect detail? How many of the lessons imparted actually stuck? How well can you pass down the same stories to your own children? If there is one thing all the stories of the Joy Luck Club have in common, it's that disconnect, that which gets lost in the generational gap between parents and children. And in the case of June, this is especially poignant because unlike the other daughters of the film, her mother dies before she can fully reconcile with her. This brings us back to...
The babies. You know, 2 babies?
The babies.
That's right. All those years, June believed that her mother had killed her babies. But after Soo-yeon passes away, June finally learns the whole story. On her way to Chungking, Soo-yeon came down with dysentery. She could no longer feed her babies, and her own strength was fading. So, she placed the babies by the side of the road, with all her money and belongings, in the hopes that someone would find them and take care of them. And then she went off to find a place to die, not wanting to do so in front of her children. But, unfortunately for her, after passing out, Soo-yeon was found by a medical van, and she lived. June never forgave her mother, because she didn't know any of this. Nor did she know that Soo-yeon had spent her whole life trying to find her children, or that, after her death, her friends finally succeeded. The film ends with June going to meet her half-sisters. But before this, she is forced to confront the fact that there was so much about her mother that she never knew, that she never bothered to learn. So much of what Soo-yeon did now comes into focus, such as her transfixing all her hope onto June. But so much still remains a mystery. Even after June discovers an actual swan feather, which her mother intended to give her at some point. With no real-life mythical base to work from, this really only raises more questions than it answers. What does the swan feather mean? Was the swan real? June and we are bursting with questions, but we cannot ever find the answers to them because Soo-yeon has passed away, and with her have gone the answers. The swan's fable is a paradox. Instead of being told to preserve something across generations, it represents the idea of that which is lost across generations. It perfectly captures the themes that Amy Tan is trying to convey, and presents a very heartfelt and very personal message. Admittedly, if one were to take the swan as an actual Chinese myth, or to regard the Joy Luck Club as some cultural anthropology documentary, one would come away with a rather warped vision of the world, but surely people are smart enough to not fall into such an obvious trap, right? 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 Alright. I think I can say without fear of contradiction that Hollywood has a history of racism. We already know about Charlie Chan, Mickey Rooney, Long Duck Dong, etc., etc. You don't need me to tell you about whitewashing or yellowface in American cinema. It's existed long enough and pervasively enough that everyone has at least a general understanding of it. What is slightly less well known, or at least less talked about, is the fact that even when Hollywood takes the moral high ground on social issues, it very rarely outright challenges the status quo. I think everyone would agree that Stepin Fetchit is a far more racist character than Sidney Poitier. However, even when Poitier confronted racism and white supremacy in his films, he didn't really do it with the same bite that you'll find in something like a Spike Lee joint. This isn't to say that Poitier's films are secret white supremacist propaganda or anything, but they do present racism in a way that is comfortable to white middle-class American audiences. After all, if those same audiences are where Hollywood gets most of its ticket sales, then any movie that it makes can't afford to offend them. Literally. This, more than anything else, represents the core issue with the Joy Luck Club. All those changes to the narrative that I mentioned, they make sense from the perspective of someone trying to streamline the book's narrative for a film medium. But in the process, they also make the story less threatening to delicate white sensibilities. Mr. St. Clair's absence, Ted's beautification, the amplification of Ying Ying's first husband's abuse. These changes are all subtle, but they end up painting a picture that is all too familiar for Hollywood. While it isn't anywhere near Yellow Peril levels, it still amplifies the misogyny and toxicity of Asian masculinity, while letting white masculinity off the hook. Even the sole act of outright racism in the film is perpetuated by a white woman instead of by a man. Now, again, just because a work does not challenge a system, that does not mean it explicitly endorses those systems. The Joy Luck Club is definitely a far cry from films like Fu Manchu or Tai-Pan.
Eat. They make you very potent.
And if the Joy Luck Club was part of a much larger public canon, these changes would look far less glaring. But because the Joy Luck Club was a Hollywood movie, it got far more distribution and press exposure than an independent movie. To many people, this was the Asian American movie before Crazy Rich Asians came out. Here's your representation bone. What, you want us to throw meat as well? The idea that any single work can serve as definitive representation, it's patently ridiculous. How can the Joy Luck Club represent all of Asian America when it only has Chinese American characters? Indeed, how can it represent all of Chinese America when its characters are all of mainland Chinese descent? It can't. And yet, for the longest time, it had to. And that, more than anything else, is the tragedy of the Joy Luck Club. Now, I hate to end on such a downer note, so I think the ultimate message that I want people to take from this video, and the way that I want the Joy Luck Club to be remembered, is that it is a single part of a much larger, much more varied, and much more beautiful canon. It was neither the starting point of something greater, nor the death knell of something snuffed out before its time. Rather, it was the middle portion of a rich tapestry of film. People have said
25 years.
25 years.
25 years.
25 years.
But in those 25 years alone, a plethora of Asian American cinema has been made. There's Better Luck Tomorrow, Saving Face, that one film Justin Chon made, yeah. And even before the Joy Luck Club, there were films like Chan is Missing or A Great Wall. If you want just a smattering of the total canon, you can head on down to places like the Saturday School Podcast or the Angry Asian Man blog. It's all out there. Why does representation matter? Because you are not alone. Somewhere out there is a story that speaks your truth, and if Hollywood cannot provide it for you, the larger community of the internet can't. We just have to find our own joy and make our own luck. So, I'm Marco Keen, signing off, and I hope you liked this video. If you did, and you'd like to see me make more, please leave a like or comment down below, and I'll see ya. Bye-bye.